one of the benefits of this program, we hope, is the ability to bring into this program, into this school, people with practical experience and knowledge out there in the real world with some hardcore experience. And Paul is someone I've known. We were just reminiscing. I think we first met around 2000 when I hired Hill Knowlton as my agency of record when I was at Ernst & Young, and went and met in London in Red Lion Square, the old building there. And since that time, we've been colleagues, clients, and friends, professionally and personally. And I'm really pleased that Paul, given his schedule, has taken the time to be able to be here with you tonight. But it reflects his commitment, I believe, to helping the next generation of public relations leaders, which are you people, be better at what you do. So I've asked Paul to talk in the context of this class about the business side of running an agency without being too detail-oriented, to talk about the challenges of diversity, operating ethically, etc., as well as about how the business is changing and how you as future leaders in this business need to understand both the craft and the business side of public relations. So Paul, you'll take it from there.
Thank you very much. If anybody can't understand my strange Australian accent, just put your hand up and I'll try and slow down a little bit. So what I thought I'd just do is give you a kind of macro view, 10-15 minutes. We can interrogate that through Q&A, and then we can open it up to any subject you want to deal with. Except that we're on video, so we have to be a little careful on some of the responses. So it obviously leaves the room. So first of all, I know that you're looking at the business of the business, whether it's in a corporate function or whether it's from an agency perspective.
Well, I neglected to ask them to tell you who they were. I'm sorry. So let's do that.
Well, let's do that quickly. It'd be helpful to me to know, where do you currently work now? What kind of function are you in now, and what kind of company or government organisation? So we'll run it down the line. So would you start for me?
Yes, I'm Sabrina Sussman. I'm actually a political management student at
Okay.
and I work at the United States Department of Transportation.
Very important one. Nominator is one of my colleagues at Hill Knowlton.
Oh, we're actually flying out to California to be with them next weekend.
There you go. So say that Norm for me.
And I'm Heather Curry. I do public relations work for the American College of Radiology.
Oh, very important.
I'm Donita Alfieri. I work for the president of GW.
Oh, okay.
I'm Sharice Atkins. I'm a producer at Fox 5 News.
Great.
My name is Satara Kamali, and I work in communications at the National Institute of Mental Health.
Very important, Arena.
I'm Mariana Sari. I used to work in marketing back in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
I'm Maria Bellini. I'm a full-time student.
I'm Morgan Crooks. I'm also a full-time student.
Good for you.
I'm Caroline Roth. I work for a lobbying firm.
Okay.
I'm Alexi Minchin. I work for the Department of Agriculture.
Okay.
I'm Kara Capelli. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey.
Okay.
I'm Justin Hubbard. I do communications for an academic group here at GW.
Oh, okay.
Angela Young. I work for the U.S. Department of Transportation.
Transportation. Okay.
I'm Jeremy Sines, and we work for myself.
Good.
The toughest client of all.
I'm Whitney Veit. I also work at the Department of Transportation.
Wow, transportation. It's good to see them committed.
I'm Shanshan Lee. I'm a full-time student.
Okay.
I'm Mark Fell, and I work at the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission.
Okay.
I'm here at Institute of Government Affairs for the American College of Surgeons.
Okay.
I'm Lauren Swartz. I do communications with the American Society of Civil Engineers.
Okay, so we effectively have what? Is that right? Do we get one agency person? Counting sort of public affairs, lobbying shop as an agency person. Everybody else kind of works for an entity, whether it be a government entity or a charity or whatever. And I know that the coursework requires you to kind of think as agency people. And I'm afraid I've done that for far too long, and that's sort of the way I can think of. But that's helpful, perhaps. Kind of welcome. Sorry, where do you work?
Work at Edelman.
Okay, there we are. 2 agency people. All right, so you got an expert here. You got an expert. So before you want to look at the business of the business changes. There are some fundamental things: ethics, commercial practice, billing practices, budgeting, how you record results, how do you communicate and market those results, how do you represent your entity or your agency to either a client or your internal clients. Those things sort of never change. But what changes is how you do that based upon the context that's happening either in business or politically or in society. And there are a couple of things happening that what I call mega context stuff that are changing how you operate at a commercial level. And I'm not going to go into them in detail, but I'm just going to touch on them because they do affect how you deal with the business of the business. And the first thing is a social one, and you're the generation that's all a part of it, and that is that the internet is completely disintermediating the traditional gatekeeper to opinion formers, which were the politicians themselves, or indeed the media. And it's also creating a globality. So the Arab Spring is an example of that. You're starting to see an element of consumer media, citizen media is effectively becoming wholesale. And that completely changes the dynamic of how you approach the communication challenge. And in some ways, you're welcome, come on in. They always say leave the best to last. So, so that's a big change. I'm going to come back to what that means if you have a marketing part to what you do. And the second big challenge is just the ever demanding nature of particularly American capitalism. And public relations broadly was invented by America. The English lay some claim to it, but we'll ignore that. And if you look at it, the growth in public relations really is the natural extension of a vibrant capitalist democracy where education has created a pluralism of society and not necessarily harmony, but sometimes discord. And that also changes both the need for public relations. So they're the two massive inflection points that create a context for how you run the business of the business. And I'll come to a very specific example of that. So looking at it from an agency, agencies tend to not get involved on the ordinary everyday things that most of you do because they're expensive. And why would you want to pay somebody from an agency to do what you do? And so already you have the value equation that's going on in the client's mind of where does this person add value and where don't they add value. And so you're seeing some changes. Now, there are two areas. Agencies are getting very actively pulled in the area of what I call extreme counsel, massive crisis, because they often have, one, they have arms and legs, they have bodies, they have people that they can deploy against that problem. They often have expertise that you don't have, or they have people who have done that many times before, and you mightn't have done that. And at a time of insecurity and apprehension, whoever's your organizational leader, whether it be, it's a bit hard for a Secretary of Transportation to take in outside counsel, but sometimes even a government department will solicit outside counsel, but a charity, a company particularly, will solicit that outside counsel because the chief executive, whoever that represents, has never been exposed to these sort of issues. And most of the areas I've got involved in, I wasn't necessarily exposed to them too, but I had done more extenuating circumstances. So, I've advised 3 of the large accounting firms relative to accounting frauds. Well, there's not many people apart from Larry who have advised accounting firms on what a failure in accounting policy has done. So when that happens, either to a company or to an accounting firm, who are you going to call? It's a bit like the Ghostbusters. So agencies consultancies get into that. Now, that creates the first dynamic relative to budgeting and ethics. What assignments do you take on? What assignments don't you take on? Because some of these assignments, do you take on the coal mine where those poor coal miners died? Do you take them on as a client? Do you prejudge them relative to their own safety standards? That's a question that several agencies had to take on. Or do you take on a country? Do you take on Libya or Syria? Would you do that? Or would you take on, which is a real case, the Indian government was soliciting for agencies about 5 years ago to support their nuclear testing program. So you have an ethical issue relative to those extreme situations, but you also have a pricing issue. Because It's no longer, if you're doing a week's work or 2 weeks' work or 3 weeks' work, how do you price that? And equally, if you're in charge of that budget, how do you allocate budgets for that? And this is the first tip. Whenever there's a crisis, there is no budget. You just go to the chief executive and say, I need this amount of money, we don't know how much it's going to cost, and it happens. And you make it immediately outside of the core element of what you're dealing with. And that leads to a tension between agencies because they're now charging by value, not by price, which is the cost-plus mechanism of most agencies and how they charge. So that creates a tension already there. So you all saw the BP oil disaster last year, and a very good firm called Brunswick, an English firm, was retained for that. They'd made about $10 million for advising BP on that oil spill. Do you think that was well spent? How do you judge? What's the ROI? What do you think was BP's ROI? Keep the chief executive on the job? That didn't work. So it becomes very hard for a client to determine where the value is in such an extreme situation where management's going, come on in, we just need somebody. We just need somebody, and I don't really care. And there's leading to a change, particularly on the corporate side, where American boards are starting to insert advisors like myself into the equation. And they do that based upon past experience and necessary rather than expertise. So in the case of Brunswick, they effectively had a Republican lead dealing with a Democratic White House. Was that a smart thing to do? Probably not. Because politics is now a large part of business and it's a big driver, and being here in Washington, you see that. So that's the first dimension, which is these extreme, what I call multiple projects, and that's increasingly how agencies are getting used by clients for discrete entities. And then on the second part, I'm going to come back to my friend the internet. On the second part is that for marketing, particularly based upon marketing to people, either marketing ideas or marketing products to people, it's become so pervasive. And the people who can best tell the story, who best understand what's happening in social media, who can best galvanize that to make a story relevant to a community, are people like you. And that's led to two tensions within the corporate environment which affect the business of your business. The first one is anybody who's got a marketing in their title is looking at this. They're seeing advertising become less relevant. They're seeing this social media stuff which they don't understand become more important. And they're going, I think I need to do that. I don't want my PR people doing that. I want to do that. And I'll use a specialist agency to do that. So you're seeing that kind of tension happen already. I have a colleague called Mary Lee Sachs. She's launching a book next week in Cannes. The big global creativity festival is happening in Cannes next week. I suppose if you're going to be creative, you may as well be creative on French champagne on the Riviera. And in that book, it's called The Changing MO of the CMO. And she's a PR practitioner, but she collaborated with marketing people. And the universal theme is marketing people, for once, are starting to get reputation matters. Whereas they used to say, oh, look, you just take care of that, PR people. They're starting to understand reputation contaminates. Look at what happened to Toyota. GM, they understand it, they get it. And the second part that's happening is they understand that having a direct dialogue with their customers or prospective customers is fundamental to their success. Particularly since if you think about the marketing people, they've already been disintermediated if they're selling products through retailers. They've been disintermediated by the retailers. Walmart has disintermediated Procter & Gamble from having a relationship with its customers. So how does Procter & Gamble retake some kind of dialogue, connection, relevance with its customers? Well, it can do advertising, but I don't know. Have anybody seen a Pantene commercial recently? You know, it doesn't set the house on fire. Whereas if you create a dialogue like Pepsi did with Refresh, the Refresh campaign, if you try and create a dialogue with people, that becomes important. And marketing has so much more money than corporate communications. For them to put $1 million off a limited spurt of advertising into a social media program is very easy. It's nothing, it doesn't even dent. But to get that money, if you are an entity in communications, you have to be able to propose a different way of doing it. It's not PR. You have to be able to propose a planning methodology that demonstrates that what you're doing will deliver the maximum ROI, so that you understand how the brand works in this media. 2, you have to be able to articulate ways of measuring and be accountable for that measurement before you see the money to do what you need to do. So it requires a different way to deal with the internal client community. So I give you the 2 extremes. One is the specialist advisory part of the marketplace, and the second part is what is becoming the fight zone in enterprises, which is around social media. And the very large packaged goods companies, probably led by Procter & Gamble. So Procter & Gamble, agencies tend to know who spends the money. Procter & Gamble spends more money on consumer marketing than any other packaged goods company in the world, probably followed by Unilever, and they're the natural big global rivalries. And Procter & Gamble has a slew of agencies, and any product in any country is probably worth at least $1 million to an agency out of a Procter & Gamble brand. Because Procter & Gamble did a massive amount of research, and they determined, and you can all look this up if you're interested on looking at the value of public relations, they determined that whenever there was a public relations element to a campaign, remember in marketing you tend to think in campaign, you don't tend to think in long-term conversations, you're thinking in campaigns. Whenever there was a public relations element to the component, 1, it provided the best return on investment, and 2, it was a multiplier effect on all the other elements. Now they measured that with some very scientific stuff. I'm always skeptical on any of the measurement relative to marketing, but they determined that. And so as a result, they almost have it a law. You cannot do a Procter & Gamble campaign unless there's a public relations dimension. And because they saw it as so specialized, they have PR people in Procter & Gamble, have lots of them, but most of the massive implementation is done by agencies. So in some cases you have the enterprises, the corporations, the government departments are insourcing more and outsourcing specialist work and then wholesale large implementation work. But they're not using agencies on retainer. So agencies either have to campaign after campaign or discrete projects. So that's just to provide an inflection point of what the context is for how agencies are being used, what's happening relative to pricing, what's happening in terms of whether it's project or retainer. And you can imagine a large wholesale implementation you're going to be far more price sensitive about than maybe a substantial crisis involving corporate governance and dissident shareholders and fraud and all of those kinds of things. So it's 2 kind of different models. And that in itself is having a major impact on the agency marketplace. So as you go to select an agency, or if you go to sell as an agency, you are beginning to sort through what's different between these agencies. They're not all the same. And who has the best experience set that's going to fit with me? I know you come on to marketing and sales later on, but they all look the same, but they all actually have small differences. And so the criteria for selection, you have to then swap the other side of the table. If you're selling to a client, you also have to exploit those criteria for selections to favor your agency, and that's the sales and marketing piece. So there's I've gone a bit more than 10 minutes, which is my want. And I'm more than happy to open up to any questions you have about that specific dynamic, and then we can explore anything else you wish to explore within the time. Does anybody radically disagree? Yes?
Well, do you feel like PR people are getting to the same level of marketing as far as the respect within a company, or is communication being elevated also as something that CEOs are thinking about?
It is. I'm going to make some massive generalizations because there are total exceptions based on the people and the companies and so on. Remember, I'm mostly seeing chief executives at a time of extremis. Okay, so it's not situation normal. You know, they're worried they're going to get fired, or you know, they're going to have to sit in front of Congress and explain what they did, or they're very unsettling times. Their issue to me is, why can't my people be more like your people? Now, that means that broadly I'm seeing that they want their PR function, their communications function, to elevate up. And I ask them, I say, well, these are good people, I work with them, these are my clients, what's your problem with them? And the issue is that they're functionally effective, They often even like their PR people, but they're not commercially connected. So what they want is they actually want their senior communications leaders to be a part of the commercial understanding of the business.
Isn't that what the communication people want too? To be that connected?
It is, but if you look at what tends to happen, they tend to get caught with the reactive. Most people who work in a corporate function are overworked. They have, far too many media calls they've got to answer. Now they've got the bloggers coming on in, they've got to answer it. They don't have the resources. They're not game to articulate because they know that everything's tight for the additional resources. So they're seen as an effective downstream function. And if you look at that, that's just not what I would say. If you look at how most, I'm going to have to go to the corporate example because I'm not as familiar with government departments, but if you go to most corporates and you look at how the PR function is structured within the organization, increasingly it's reporting to general counsel or CMO, not the CEO. So it's already being pushed down one layer. And two, the PR function, you would argue that the kind of art of public relations is that it's about dealing in a multi-stakeholder environment. The essence of public relations from even a theoretical perspective is this multi-stakeholder environment. But most PR functions have nothing to do with investor relations. Often they have nothing to do with the employee piece, because that's often under HR. They often don't even have anything to do with the political agenda, which is done somewhere over here. And so what they end up doing is sort of media relations, and they're seen often as that, rather than at a holistic level in terms of what does it mean. I was with a chief executive recently, and I said, what do you mean that you want your comms people to be, more effective? He said, listen, my general counsel's a lawyer, and he's a very good lawyer, and I assume he's got all the legal stuff sorted, and I don't worry about that. He brings it to me when I need to know. But when we sit around the table and we talk about how we're going to grow, or what our emerging market strategy is, or what do we need to do relative to R&D, he has a point of view, and I listen to him because it's helpful. And when I have a problem, I talk to manufacturing, and of course they do great manufacturing and great development, but they often have a view about where we need to push the business and where we can get the greatest return. Come on in. And when I talk to my head of communications, they don't have a strong enough point of view about where we can maximize share price, value, growth. I'm looking for that. Well, I can't say that because that was my client, so I wasn't going to put my client out of a job. But it's true. There is an enormous spectrum of heads of communication departments, and it is integral. What tends to happen for a lot of the people in communications departments is they've been very expert at a craft dimension within the department. They're very good at dealing with the media, or they're very good at dealing with events, or they're really good at and they kind of get to that role. But they're not managing the function. And there's a big difference between being able to put out a fire in a crisis to being able to manage a function that really touches everything the corporation or the organization does.
I wonder if we're going to see that changing as we have programs like this. Like this program, and Larry just probably told me this, is very holistic in that we focus a lot on strategy, and probably others are too, as you see the next generation.
I think I can guarantee the next generation of communication professionals will be a lot better than the ones that I grew up with. Partly because there's more academic rigor in what you're doing, partly because the function is becoming more important just because of social media. I do believe that the international dimension requires a degree of sensitivity that marketing often hasn't displayed. You can't ignore China or India or the Arab world. You do so at your peril. So you have to bake into your thinking, what does that mean for these other parts of the world? So I do believe that Larry's correct, but then I would always agree with Larry. Yes?
I guess my question is, I think I would make the argument that there's actually a problem with the progression and professionalization of the field, which is I see this a lot, especially in the government. There are press people, there are people who are great at running a story, there are former journalists who are now communications people, there are events people, but that the professionalization of the strategic communications thinker, the one who's able to implement an evolution strategy, the one who's able to kind of sit among the board and have those conversations, has been stilted. And I see part of the cause of that is the environment hasn't been ripe enough for communications to be taken seriously. But the other thing is, back on our end, I don't know if communications professionals have done enough to segment themselves.
They absolutely haven't. Communication professionals are very good at talking to each other about how important communications are. They're very poor at evangelizing the role. And the closest you get to that, and even in society, you've noticed that. I mean, 15 years ago, no serious newspaper would have talked about a PR disaster. Whereas now people talk about the PR disaster. BP, PR disaster. People talk about that. But you're not talking about what a fantastic campaign. Whereas ad agencies still get what a fantastic campaign. You know, the Dove Real Beauty campaign. What a fantastic campaign. You know, that won awards and things like that. So PR is still a fair sale within the organization. It's not a reward sale. And I would split that. I first began my career working for a company, Unilever, and I learned the basics of marketing there. And I remember once a marketing director saying, you've got to understand that all marketing deals with either fear or greed. And there's an element of truth in that, because if you want people to change a behavior, you have to give them some emotional element to galvanize the change. You can't just make it a rational case. It either has to be about something I'm scared of getting or it's going to happen to me, or something I want. And I think that PR at a broad sort of level has done a reasonable job at up-leveling the fear part of why you need public relations, has done a terrible job at evangelizing the greed part, what you get for it. I also think that if you look at where PRs come from, and this is not meant to be offensive to any academic institution that's grown great graduates, it is overly focused on the craft piece. It's not focused enough on economics and global business and, you know, what does that mean, and critical issues and critical thinking capability. And so a lot of the just pure communications programs at an undergraduate level throw up proficient craftspeople as opposed to that critical thinking capability dealing with the global economy. You can disagree with me, by the way. That makes it more fun, for me at least. Yes?
One of the ways I'm seeing it come to success or failure is if you've been able to get the PR and the marketing piece within the organization's strategic plan, and it starts to then maybe Christmas tree your issue across the department and raises the profile. So I think there's a limited number of times that's been successful, but that's another opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, in how you change that, that's much more pragmatic, and that is a good segue. I mean, most PR plans, when I look at it, so if I go into a company and it is mainly a company, I go, what's your PR plan? And there's a basic plan is that we will communicate honestly and openly and transparently with all our stakeholders, you know, and to do this we'll have a press function and we'll have a social media desk and, you know, we'll have the internal piece or whatever, and it turns into an org chart. And I go, I sit down often with my client, I go, what's the number one thing happening with your organization right now? What's the chief executive's principal objective? Like, what gets them fired or promoted or a pay increase? Where is this organization most focused? And if you can't answer that, you don't have a PR plan. If you can answer that and relate it to your PR plan, you have the basis for having a commercial dialogue. But very rarely do I see that. I'd call that the biggest gap. And when I look at it, I go, and how does, the second question I asked, a bit nasty, I go, so how does the 2010 plan compare to the 2009 plan? Oh, we have an extra head count. But that's not answering the question, because most organizations, whether they're government departments, NGOs, charities, corporations, and even agencies, live on quarterly cycles where things change all the time, either driven externally or driven internally. And unless your communications plan actually completely intersects with that commercial objective, you are irrelevant. And I think how do you become relevant is get connected back to that piece. Yes?
So what would be a good answer to your question?
Which one?
The first one, you know, if you want the CEO to expand their salary and, you know, really execute their PR plan in a well-done way, what would be, you know, you say if they can't answer the question, they don't have a PR plan, but what would be a good answer to the question?
Well, good answer. I mean, pick a company. Name a company. Any company, go on, name one.
Walmart.
Walmart, perfectly. I can tell you, right now, Walmart has a growth problem. They have absolutely tailed out on the growth. They're really struggling to get the growth. And you would think that as the world's largest retailer, growing around the world in a time when people are concerned about price inflation, there is rampant food inflation and clothing inflation in the United States. You don't see it in the figures because food doesn't count as part of the inflation figures. You would think that the largest buyer of these items in the United States would be having a very good sales cycle. It's not. It's being outmarketed by other retailers, and their growth slowed. They have got the big box model. They haven't been able to work to multiple size retail opportunities. They have an ongoing union issue. They have an ongoing trust issue with the American people who like the low prices, but really don't like the fact that how they treat their employees. And they're seen as a belligerent and arrogant company. Now, I'm making that up, but I'm pretty sure that the chief executive, if he was being really honest, would at least agree to the low growth piece. And that's hurting their stock price. And I think the last chief executive left prematurely, partly because of that. Okay, so what can communications do to help him? If you can answer that question, you can have whatever headcount and budget you want. But, you know, and I'm sure that is. I mean, Walmart's a pretty serious organization when it comes to that. I'm sure they're having that kind of dialogue. But you have to be able to deal, first of all, with the commercial entity before you deal with the communications entity. And most of the communications plans I see tend to be communications plans, and then they kind of try and backfit them into some kind of corporate presence. But you can name any company. What's Google's issue? What's Facebook's issue? What's Yahoo's issue? Or IBM's issue? Or you name the company. Ford, General Motors. So they all have issues, and unless your plan connects directly with that issue. I mean, there's 3 people here from the Department of Transportation. What does the current secretary, what does he want? Now, he has things that he says are very important, that he's agreed with the president. But every secretary is also looking at their legacy. It's a different kind of buyer. So what can you do that can drive the secretary's legacy as a successful Secretary of Transportation? What is the 1 or 2 things? Because you can't do, the department has, 100 items on the go? It has huge agenda. But from a communications perspective, in terms of prioritizing resources, you can make the mistake and try and follow all 100, or you can say, we'll try and do the best we can on 97 of them, but these 3, do you agree, are the most important ones that are going to make the changes here? And if they agree, then you'll see resources come towards you. Anybody else? Yeah.
You said products organizations cannot ignore the BRICS or emerging markets.
Yeah.
How does a worldwide firm like H&K help an organization localize its PR message? What's the health public relations aspect to toothpaste?
It's done by talking with the local people who work with you in those markets. I will say there's a cultural dimension. American companies tend to be initially immune to that kind of local sensitivity, and European companies tend to be far more, they do the exact other way. So American companies tend to globalize very, very quickly and go, you will do it this way, and then they wrestle the outliers to the ground where they can speak the language. And European companies go the other way, they go whatever the local people want. The American system tends to drive cost efficiencies and savings and gives that kind of breakthrough, but they sometimes lose things in the nuance. So for example, in China, Coca-Cola has an issue which it wasn't really aware of, in that older Chinese people, particularly in the countryside, quite like Coca-Cola, but they drink it warm as medicine. So how does that fit with cold and youth and all of that kind of stuff going? So yeah, how do you do that? So that's Hill Knowlton does that way, and there's a number of different models for how you manage a global account, and one of those models is how do you have that interaction with your local people. But equally, that's where you need to be able to have the planning capability, particularly as it relates to products, because consumer products do vary around the world. Many years ago, I was working with Kellogg's, and Kellogg's came from this Battle Creek mission that breakfast was at the essence of a healthy person. It wasn't just like it was a spiritually healthy person. They came from that.
I remember this year, that was fine, because I remember the people in Milan on this very subject.
There is. And you go across to Europe, and of course you go breakfast. Now in America, I don't know what you think about as breakfast. What's the word connotate? Well, I tell you what, in France it's a croissant. You know, and in Norway or Sweden, it's some salmon and bread. That's breakfast. And in Germany, it's probably cold sausages and cheeses with a little bit of salad and bread. It's like a sandwich. So breakfast means different things to different people. So how do you market? It's not breakfast. It's the Kellogg's breakfast into those markets without being culturally insensitive. And it gets even more so when you get into Asia. If you go to China and Japan, breakfast means different things there. So it is that kind of discussion with the client. Most European clients understand it. Most Asian clients understand it because they tend to have grown up, if you like, far more aware that there are differences immediately around them, and therefore they tend to respect that. But I think that'll begin to change because the cost of marketing is becoming such a large item. So I'll give you a factoid back to my mass outsourcing and marketing. For the large consumer goods companies, you know, the Nestle's, the Crafts, the Colgate-Palmolives, the Unilevers, the Procter & Gamble's, and now there's a whole lot. There's the Reckitt Benckiser out of Germany, and those companies, particularly when they sell beauty products, those companies, many years ago, manufacturing was the largest cost item they had. Well, manufacturing now is no longer the largest cost item because manufacturing technology has come to such a level that manufacturing costs now represent a quite smaller percentage. The largest single cost of a consumer product, of your tube of Colgate, of your Dove soap, is the marketing cost, the marketing and sales cost. That's the largest single cost. Now, so just park that for a sec. Most large consumer goods companies grow broadly at the rate of global GDP. Anybody know what global GDP is right now? Go on, throw me a guess. Anybody know what US GDP is? It's under 2%. They keep on revising it down. It's about 2.2, it's now about 1.9, and who knows what it'll be next quarter. Global GDP is broadly about 4%. On a regular cycle, we're not in that regular cycle, it's 5%. Emerging market GDP is about 7%. China's currently growing about 9%. So these big companies like Procter & Gamble tend to grow with the global economy, which makes sense if you think about it. So let's just call that, because that's nice easy math, about 5%. Well, the cost of marketing for most of these firms, if it's your largest cost, has been going up about 7 to 10% for the last 7 years, partly because of the cost of advertising. Because the media guys got a little aggressive, and so they started asking for more and more. Super Bowl advertising went up, American Idol advertising went up. So the cost of advertising, the cost of marketing, driven by the cost of advertising, TV, has been the largest single cost item for them. Now, if that's your largest cost, you can't have that cost going up at a higher level than your revenues go up, which is leading to a complete reevaluation of the marketing mix, which is why public relations has an opportunity to be more important. So, to your question, public relations, which was dealt locally in the past, is now becoming more important in trying to deal because of the cost synergies of it and the collateral overlaps and what can we do. And they'll often group markets together and then they'll try and reduce the cost to make that happen. Yeah?
I want to kind of go back to something you had mentioned earlier, Brunswick, when they were, BP was their client during the oil spill. And it seemed like that the BP executives here were just making one verbal misstep after another. Was that because, did they bring in Brunswick late, or is that simply because maybe in Europe it is so different, things like, referring to citizens as little people, or, I want my life back. Would that not have played so badly over in Europe? I guess my question is, my larger point is PR so much different on a, even though we are becoming very global, is it so much different from Europe to America?
No, it's not so fundamentally different. It moves a little faster in the United States. So So from an academic perspective, everybody talks about the Tylenol case. Tylenol would have been a disaster if it happened today, because they took about 2 days to respond. But back then that was okay. That was pretty fast response for a corporate. Now you've got about 30 minutes to respond. So the US environment, particularly with social media and Twitter, is just so much faster. I don't think we should purloin Brunswick because we don't know. I've been on this side. I've been on the side where people go, what are those idiots doing in the agency? You don't know all the facts. You don't know necessarily what disputes are happening with the legal department, and that's often the major fault line in a crisis. And you don't know what advice was given and ignored. I've been in that situation where I gave the right advice, it was ignored, I gave it again, it was ignored, I gave it again, and when the pain got so much, they had to follow it, and then they followed, but it's now 3-4 days late, and it's just got worse. So you don't know. I mean, I'm sure they did fine, but I'll give you an example of fast approach. The same year, the BP oil spill in magnitude was huge. You know, it was obviously catastrophic. Although, of interest, it's probably going to have less impact in terms of the Gulf than the current floods going out of the Mississippi River, which is interesting that nature itself could be far more devastating. That same year, there was another oil spill. Anybody know where it was? It was on a river in the United States. No? What a great crisis. And it was a Canadian oil company, Enbridge, and Enbridge had an oil spill on a US river, and it was an error, and they didn't know and they didn't meet it. But immediately, they moved in, they communicated, the chief executive went straight to the town that was affected. He knocked on the doors, he apologized personally, they put people in touch with, we'll buy your houses because we know the property's gone down, you know, and he went before Congress twice. He was applauded for how he conducted himself. But to be fair, he was a chief executive that took counsel, and he overruled his lawyers, because the lawyers never want to admit culpability. Because if you as a firm, and this is what happened in BP, let's backwind to BP. BP they had suppliers in this. Remember, they had Transocean who owned the rig, and you know they had Halliburton who was responsible for construction. So they didn't want to pick up the whole tab. They knew they were going to pick up the public domain, but they weren't just going to go, okay, all our fault, we'll sort it out, don't worry about it. They weren't going to do that because the lawyers are going, no way, because that could be $40 billion. And these other guys, they've got to be on the tab for this piece because we have contracts with them, and they clearly failed on their contract. So the tension is between the natural communication to be honest, to be immediate, to take some accountability for it, to dealing with the lawyers on no way. There's no way we're going to give up all that money. And so there's a permanent tension there. Larry.
Let me just shift gears a bit here for the benefit of the class and ask you to talk about advice to the students either currently or soon to be in the job market. How do they go about branding themselves, building their career? What is the best advice? What is the best kind of candidate that they can be?
Well, it depends on where you want to work for a start, whether you want to work for agency or whether you want to work for a government department or a commercial entity. So from an agency perspective, because clients are increasingly buying depth in skills at a more kind of entry level or junior level into agencies, they're looking for extreme skills in one specialization. So if you have been active in social media, they will want to see that you have a track record in that you've worked with that you may have been involved in a campaign in that. Because you've got to remember that most of the people who run agencies are at least my age. In fact, they're all older than me. And so, you know, it's all very struggling with this kind of world. It's a new world for them. So you've got to focus on the thing that you can bring that they don't have or that's in demand because the clients are demanding that. So that on an agency side. In the corporate environment, it is sometimes the same. If you're looking at still entry level, you're looking at obviously one thing. Is it around, and it's still a craft-based piece. You're not employed day one as the strategic holistic communications counselor. That happens over time. So you're really looking for what's the thing that you want to be known for, be known as. What's your starting point? And my suggestion is you don't go too specialized too quickly. You allow some flexibility so that you can move within the space. In agencies, they tend to increasingly hire around sector skills. So you're not a specialist. So if you work in an agency, you're either passionate about consumer products, or you're passionate about technology, or you're passionate about health and beauty. You're passionate about pharmaceuticals. Very few people get passionate about B2B, but it is a big part of most agencies, or professional services. Or you're very interested in crisis and you want to get connected to that. So they tend to hire not along service lines, but more about the sectors, because the clients who are buying in those sectors want to see that you know as much or more than they know within the sector. They want to know what their competitive set are doing. They want to know somebody who can talk about that. So increasingly the opportunity is to work out where to go. Now that's very hard to do if you're young. I mean, do you really know what you're that interested in? Some people do. I've been doing this for a long time and I've still no idea. So you need to basically have some flexibility. Most agencies run internship programs leading to employment. Most of the big agencies do. And it's a great way to spend a year out of like whatever program to do that. And particularly on the basis you maybe get to work in like 2 departments or 3 departments. And that's a good starter. All the big ones, Fleischmann, Weber Shandwick, Edelman, Hill Knowlton, Burson Marsteller, Ketchum. I'm probably missing too many, but they all run pretty decent programs. They tend to be more New York centric. There are some ones in DC. Most London agencies do the same thing. International is another great opportunity for packaging yourself, because given the globalization happening around the world, for somebody in China to work in the United States is great experience back in China. The marketplace is not yet as developed in China, but it's growing very, very quickly. Or for Americans to work in Europe, if you're interested in public policy. So everybody thinks this is the capital of the world. We're in the capital of the world. More regulations are written in Brussels than written in DC. And for example, the Chinese government, there's a massive case around the world of regulatory outsourcing. So if you think about the cost of a government to create regulations, it's enormous. You need scientists. I mean, should we have how much of this percentage in this perfume or this soap? And what about wastewater dumping? How much of that's happening? So you have small countries around the world. And what they do is, we can't determine whether that medicine's safe. We'll do whatever the Americans do, or we'll do whatever the Europeans do. And the Europeans have realized that this is an opportunity for them to effectively become legal imperialists. And China is increasingly adopting European standards, not American standards. So if you're interested in working in government, in public policy, you go and work in Brussels for a year. That's a great experience to bring back to the United States. So it's that first year is to look for where the demand is going to be to come back either in a corporate or an agency. So go deep into a sector or go deep into a geography. In Hill Knowlton in China, we have something like 10 Americans working who are all fluent. They all want to learn Chinese. They want to speak it. The pay is not yet American scale. We have one European working in India who's passionate about understanding the Indian marketplace. Huge opportunities on that. So there are opportunities and they're leverageable. Is that a good answer? Anybody else have any questions? Yes.
Well, throughout the history of PR as a practice, it's obviously been a struggle to define ourselves. From Eddie Bernays claiming we're more than publicists to today we're more than just marketers. Groups like PRSA obviously are starting to set down professional and ethical standards that are guiding this freight train. Can you see 10 years down the road where we're headed in terms of standards, both professional to sort of define us and ethical to kind of guide us? Do you see the profession being something that's as regulated as medicine or law or anything approaching that type of standardization?
Because there's too much judgment required. And I don't see it becoming more regulated. I think there's a permanent issue. There's a natural suspicion, particularly outside the United States, but even in the United States, despite the First Amendment to the Constitution, that lobbyists can somehow intervene or manipulate the process of government. There's even more so around the rest of the world. And the area that's come under the most scrutiny relative to attempts at regulation have been the disclosure policies around how you deal with government. And indeed, in India, there was a famous case recently where a senior PR person was caught, who works for the Taaffe family, caught bribing the Ministry of Telecoms a lot of money. So it still is abuse. And what tends to happen is most of the good firms sign up to these codes of conduct, but the lapses that happen tend to happen often at a very junior level, often without necessary oversight, and they're not necessarily even intentional. You know, ethics is taught. I mean, Hill Knowlton Hill Knowlton had a very troubled past when I arrived there in the 90s. I mean, if you go and Google Hill Knowlton or Wikipedia it, you can find out that Church of Scientology and Eli Lilly and Catholic bishops against abortion, and there was and the ultimate was Kuwait, which is the only thing I could defend, but they didn't do it at the time. And so as a result, plagued by that reputational problem, they took it very seriously. My predecessor took it very seriously in sort of cleaning shop. But governments are overtaking that. So, for example, America has Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I can tell you most of the Chinese agencies violate the American foreign practice because they pay journalists. It's standard practice in China to pay the media. So the good agencies eschew that policy and the less reputable ones take it on. Some of them are international agencies. But the UK has come out with a far more egregious thing because the American foreign corruption leads to a fine. The UK has come out with an anti-bribery act, and that leads to a criminal sentence of a director of the company, even if he had nothing to do with it, but one of his subsidiaries was involved with effectively bribery to seek a contract. So I think you're seeing at a macro level this level playing field being done at a regulatory. I don't see at a local public relations level that happening. I think you're going to see sort of more of the ethical programs being taught within agencies, within corporations. Most corporations, particularly American corporations, because of the demand for diversity, fair play, appropriate behavior in the workplace, which is not required in Europe. I mean, I can tell you the work environment in Europe is very different to the work environment in the United States. Have required that, and it leads to sort of codes and sanctions and performance appraisals relative to those sort of things. So I think you're seeing that happen. I don't see regulation happening. It's too hard to regulate.
We have time for one more question. Who wants to ask it?
I do have one.
Okay.
So you touched upon briefly how you kind of break into a career, but what about for those of us who've been, like I've been working as a PR professional for 3 years now, what's the next step towards advancement? I feel like I found my niche, mostly in media relations, but what really should I do next? Because obviously I'm going to climb the ladder, but I really sometimes feel like I don't know where to go. What would be my next step?
So, and you work for, again?
The American College of Radiology.
Okay, American College of Radiology. So, public relations is probably the most mobile of the professions. And the more senior you get, you can cross to agency and back to corporate and so on. So it is very mobile. But you're defined by your work. So the moving up the ladder, if you can't move where you are, you can cross to another place. But you have to ask yourself the question, and I challenge this to all the people who work at Hill Knowlton. Every year your CV has to double, particularly from the age of graduate to 30. Your CV has to double. If you are not doubling your CV and doing what you're doing, you should consider leaving. I say, leave Hill Knowlton. If your CV, if you're blocked and you're not getting, if you're doing the same thing you did last year again, then leave. You've got to absolutely double down on the experiences you can have and the type of work. Campaigns particularly drive your CV. So if you're involved in the creation of a successful campaign, and are your leverage points to go elsewhere, to go somewhere else in the medical field, to go into an agency, to go into a medical device producer because you understand the subject matter. So you have choices, either in terms of exploiting the subject matter knowledge you have, or if it's campaign, possibly go to agency or other health-related fields where there's campaigns that are possible. So you do have those opportunities. But the minute you start doubling your CV, particularly if you're under the age of 30, is you're going backwards. There's too much competition out there. You need the caseload to show what you've been doing. And it has to be very specific about some kind of result. And that's why I think you get to it during this thing. You have to be able to document why you did what you did and what results did it create. And those results can't just be clippings. They have to be, you know, we changed the behavior, or we did a post-survey result on that. And indeed, you're in the right city for this, because a lot of things that happen in politics are now coming to mainstream communications. So political polling has now absolutely come across to mainstream communications. Most large companies, before they embark a campaign, will often do a political poll on which messages have the best resonance. You know, Penshon and Berland do that. The current Obama and McCain political polling agencies, about half of their revenues is not political. It's to do with corporates, helping them on the right kind of message in the campaign. Get involved with that, and your CV will double, and you have choices then. But it is very mobile.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Perfectly on time. Thank you very much. It's always invigorating to meet those people coming through at the younger age. As I said, I think you're going to be a lot better than the old farts like me who are already here. So I look forward to seeing that happen, seeing you nip at the heels. If any of you wanted to ask a question but didn't want to embarrass yourself or your colleagues in the class, you can always email me. I think Larry has my email address, and I'll try and answer whatever I get. But thank you again.
Thank you.